Well, hello and welcome to today's webinar on Building Safety Bill. This presentation is being given by Lachlan McLean and Emily Jordan from Forbes Solicitors. I'm a partner in the Housing Litigation Department, and Emily, my colleague, is an associate. And our work has been going on in the social housing sector for over 15 years now. And one of the areas that we are commonly asked to look at is issues around health and safety relating to social housing dwellings. This presentation is going to be focusing primarily upon the implications for registered providers of social housing in relation to the new Building Safety Bill, which is going to be addressing many of the issues which have arisen since the tragic events of the Grenfell Tower disaster. And so we're going to be examining the state of the legislation as it is currently progressing and looking at some of the wider implications of this legislation as it makes its way through Parliament. Please also note as well that today's legal topics are going to be in relation to England, and given that housing is a devolved issue across the United Kingdom, and also necessarily many of the issues we're going to be discussing today are quite general in nature because of the potential for this legislation still to be amended. However, if you have any further questions as a result of this presentation, then please do get in touch with us and we'll be very happy to help. And so I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Emily, who is going to give us a bit of an overview and then take us through the first half of the presentation.
Thanks very much, Lachlan. So as Lachlan said, we're going to be doing an overview of the measures proposed by the Building Safety Bill as currently drafted, and then thinking about what it may mean for you and how to start planning ahead. So the government published the Building Safety Bill in July 2020 to respond to long-standing concerns surrounding fire safety, quality and competence, and to bring change to ensure we don't experience another tragedy like Grenfell. The bill aims to introduce clearer standards and guidance and to create a systemic change in culture and responsibility within the building industry. Much consultation on the bill has taken place in light of recommendations by Dame Judy Packett, who is the former chair of the Health and Safety Executive. She published her independent review on building regulations and fire safety in May 2018. And the Hackett review concluded that the whole system needed major reform and that resident safety needed to be a greater priority through the entire life cycle of a building. So from design and construction through to when people are living in their homes. So as we said, the bill is in draft form and it's making its way through Parliament, and introduces a wide range of measures which we've listed here and that we're going to go on to continue to consider in more detail. The Building Safety Bill will apply to what are termed high-risk buildings, and whilst it's not yet clear which buildings these will be, it's expected to be those of 18 metres or 6 stories or more in height. And there's been calls for the Act itself to include a definition of high-risk buildings rather than prescribing such by regulations. But the bill will also propose changes applying to all building work, extending liability for non-compliance with building regulations. Part 2 of the bill contains provisions about a new building safety regulator and its functions in relation to buildings in England. The regulator will be tasked with securing the safety of people in relation to risks arising from buildings and improving the standards of buildings. So its 3 main functions will be to oversee the safety and standards of all buildings, directly assure the safety of higher risk buildings, and to improve the competence of people responsible for managing and overseeing building work. The regulator's powers will be wide-ranging, including issuing stop notices, unlimited civil fines, and commencing civil prosecutions. Building Safety Regulator will be the building control authority for high-risk buildings, and this is a significant change from the approach towards responsibility for high-risk buildings, removing them from the scope of approved inspectors and local authority building control teams. The regulator will need to be satisfied that a building meets various regulatory requirements during the planning, design, construction and occupancy phases of the building's life, and this is being referred to as the golden thread of information. Failure to meet any of these requirements will lead to enforcement action. The bill also imposes a requirement upon duty holders for mandatory reporting to the regulator of any fire and structural safety occurrences which could cause significant risk to life and safety. And a voluntary scheme for non-significant risks will also operate. In addition to a new code of conduct for building inspectors, the creation of the new accountable person and building safety manager roles will create new professional duties upon persons acting in those capacities. All duty holders will have to cooperate and share information with the regulator, as I said, the golden thread, and ensure compliance with regulations. Residents will also assume legal duties, including obligations to repair their own relevant items in repair and proper working order, and to comply with requests made by the accountable person. So I've referred to duty holders. The bill creates a new role of the accountable person, which is likely to be the person who holds a legal estate or is under a relevant repairing obligation in relation to the common parts of the building. And the accountable person will be responsible for assessing building safety risks on an ongoing basis and taking all reasonable steps to manage those risks. A safety case report must be submitted to the regulator by the accountable person. Before residents move into a building that falls under the new set of rules, the accountable person will need to register the building with the building safety regulator. And once the building is occupied, the accountable person will need to apply to the regulator for a building assurance certificate. Failure to do either of these things will be an offence. The accountable person will also be required to appoint a building safety manager before the building becomes occupied. And the building safety manager's function is to manage the building in accordance with the safety case report and the building assurance certificate. And that person must have the relevant skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours to carry out the responsibilities associated with the role. The accountable person will be required to prepare a residents' engagement strategy for promoting the participation of relevant persons in the making of building safety decisions. And a system must also be established for the investigation of relevant complaints. So looking more at residents' duties and the requirements to allow access, residents will be responsible for keeping any of their personal gas or electrical appliances that the landlord's not responsible to repair in proper working order. And the bill proposes that occupiers of high-risk buildings are to provide the accountable person with access to facilitate its performance of duties under the proposed act. Where access is not given, the accountable person will be able to apply to court for an injunction. So this may assist landlords who don't have a right of access under the terms of the lease in order to perform its statutory duties under the new act. I referred previously to a golden thread of information. Now, to preserve that golden thread and ensure that safety considerations are recognised throughout the construction project, a new system of 3 gateway points is set out within the bill, and this will be overseen by the regulator. Gateway 1 requires information to be submitted to the local planning authority in the form of a fire statement, and this will demonstrate that the fire safety requirements have been considered and incorporated into the proposals. Gateway 2 stops construction from starting until the regulator is satisfied that the design meets the functional requirements of the building regulations. And Gateway 3 takes place at completion, where all golden thread documentation must be provided to the accountable person by duty holders for submission to the regulator. And once the regulator is satisfied that there's been a full safety compliance, they will issue a completion certificate. Next major change is the introduction of a new homes ombudsman. So new build home buyers will have a right to complain to a new home ombudsman, and it may be a legal requirement for developers to be a member of the scheme. The ombudsman is intended to hold developers to account. including the ability to require them to pay compensation and fix poor building work. Finally, the bill proposes inserting new sections into the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, which will apply to long leases in high-risk buildings. Under the new legislation, the landlord will be able to recover costs associated with performing its obligations from leaseholders under a separate service charge heading called Building Safety Charges. Amongst other things, landlords will be required to serve a specific building safety budget before demanding these charges. They'll have to hold sums in a designated account on trust to pay for the work. They'll be required to prepare reconciliation accounts providing details of the works carried out and the cost, along with information about sums remaining in the account, and also carry out consultation on any proposed qualifying building safety works or qualifying building safety agreements. And the draft bill also introduces an implied covenant that the leaseholder will allow the landlord access for the purpose of inspecting the safety measures and to pay building safety charges within 28 days of demand. So that's an overview of what's being proposed by the Building Safety Bill. I'm now going to pass back to Lachlan to discuss how this may affect you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that, Emily. And obviously we can see that there's quite a lot of very new issues which we're going to have to get to grips with as this legislation unfolds. Now, many of us will be left asking the question, quite understandably, what's this going to mean in practice for the building sector? And I think, well, unfortunately, one of the caveats that I have to put on this at a very early stage, as illustrated by the crystal ball, is that we can't know exactly at this point in time what this is going to mean on a day-to-day basis for us, because there is still a fair amount of scope for this legislation to be amended. And often we have found, especially with particularly controversial pieces of legislation in recent years, there can be considerable refinement of the proposals, especially when it goes through the various scrutiny committees in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So I think it would be rather unwise of me, shall we say, to try and predict with too much certainty what final shape the legislation will take. Although obviously I think we can start to make some tentative plans based around the overall structure of what the government is seeking to introduce. What I think is perhaps more important for us to start considering at this point, though, is taking a step back and looking at the big picture of what the Building Safety Bill is looking to achieve in the wake of the Grenfell disaster. There is going to be a lot of secondary legislation which is going to come out in due course, and that will pin down a lot of the detail of the implementation of all this. But we can be starting to make some early changes now in terms of our overall approach to this. And I think there are 4 particular areas which I'd like us to be challenged on in the way that we consider building safety and building construction as an overall area. And these are ethics, skills, procurement, and board. And I think they have to build up in that direction, using ethics as a foundation and board as the pinnacle, board oversight as the pinnacle of this. So what do I mean by ethics? What I mean by that is, I think there's been a perception, whether rightly or wrongly, in society as a whole, that much of the building sector in recent years has been driven by concerns around costs and profit, more so than issues around safety, quality, and overall integrity. And so that is, I think, the key thing we want to drive at. And certainly it's something that we as solicitors have seen in terms of our own regulation, in this sort of new approach to making sure that certain professions are properly regulated. And that's driving a deeper sense of professional ethics. And so rather than trying to list very prescriptive outcomes and inviting people to find the loopholes, certainly what we as a legal profession are being challenged about now is to go back to basics and say, well, is it ethically and morally correct what we are doing? And I think that is going to perhaps be a good starting point for the building sector and construction sector as a whole, to say, do we need to perhaps go back to basics and start looking primarily at issues around safety and quality, and then making sure that that can square with the issue of cost, and making sure that there is certainly profitability in the sector, but where cost and profit is not the driving force. And I think hopefully with the aftermath of Grenfell, people would understand the need for that. And that boils down to an issue of integrity and making sure that when we approach the construction process, right from concept all the way through to completion and over an ongoing monitoring, that there is a moral integrity to the way it is conducted, and there is not an attempt to cut corners for personal advancement. Building on that, then we have to look at the issue of skills in the sector as a whole. Again, one of the things we are coming across increasingly frequently in our department in recent years in particular is complaints by new homeowners about the quality of the finish and of the workmanship of the home that they are living in and that they've purchased or paid to buy a lease of. And it seems that a recurring theme is a lack of attention to detail, that, again, corners have been cut, that there is a lack of care being shown in the construction stage and by trades operatives when they're putting together the final parts of the building. And that, I think, has to, again, come down to the issue of how skills are taught in the sector and making sure that we have the right skill mix to be able to meet the challenge of having to construct more buildings to be able to meet the housing shortage, but also better quality buildings and safer buildings as well. We appreciate as well there have been significant demands on the sector in the wake of Brexit because of potential scarcity of qualified labourers. And the coronavirus pandemic has undoubtedly taken a toll in terms of enforcing social isolation, making it more difficult to do training on the job. And it may be having an impact on young people's career choices as they are considering their examination results and where to go next when they get to school leaving age or college leaving age. It's been a challenge that the sector has faced for a very long time. The successive governments have attempted to tackle it through things like the apprenticeship scheme. But my challenge, I think, really is what can we as the building and construction sector be doing more of in order to try and boost skills, and not just nominal skills, but making sure that these are deeply learned and, again, ethically driven, to make sure that we have a workforce that's fit for the future and able to meet the challenge that this legislation is going to undoubtedly present. The next stage in that process, I would argue, is going to be what is our attitude to procurement. When we are looking to architects, designers, engineers, construction companies, health and safety management to deliver on a new building project, how is this going to be reflected in the way that we set the scoring matrix, the quality controls, the qualification criteria for moving through from PQQ to ITT and ultimately on to contract award. what legal input are you getting at this stage of writing your construction contracts? A JCT is obviously very well laid out in terms of giving you a self-select, do-it-yourself contract. But is it always going to be absolutely fit for purpose? At what stage do you perhaps need to get some additional specialist input to make sure that the contract is going to do what you want it to do in giving yourself the degree of assurance going forwards as you manage your particular projects? Are there adequate safety provisions and quality design controls written into the procurement right from the outset? How is this going to be set up to make sure that although costs are not going to be excessive and the profits are going to still be available where that is part of the equation, that nonetheless they are not going to override and dominate the procurement process to the detriment of the overall project and risk not being able to comply with the legislation when it ultimately comes to fruition. How are we going to make sure that, as well, that there is, coming back to the issue of ethics, that there is an issue of integrity, that people are not over-promising and under-delivering when it comes to the cost and what is going to be delivered for that cost? Are we going to be challenging people enough as they put in bids to make sure that unrealistically low tenders are sifted out and that people are encouraged to put in reasonable and realistic proposals? And the final consideration, in many regards the cherry on the cake, but in other regards very important to run as a common thread throughout, is the issue of board oversight. Registered providers of social housing have obligations under the regulators' governance and financial viability standards to make sure that there is adequate board oversight of all of the association's operations. And the board is required to sign off a declaration that it is adhering to all relevant laws. So the board needs to have adequate assurance of this. And what steps is the board going to take to ensure that? Ultimately, what is board oversight going to look like in your organisation? Is it going to look like an Easter egg, looking very appetising and attractive on the outside, but then when you actually break into it, there isn't very much on the inside. It's actually quite hollow. Or is your board oversight going to be more like a stick of rock, where your values and your issues of integrity are going to run all the way through from the top to the bottom, and it's going to be a very strong culture within the organisation of safety and quality? And the final mental analogy would be that of an iceberg. Obviously, the board is going to only see the very tip of what's going on within the organisation. But what ability does it have to really delve deeper and see what is going on further down in the organisation? Is there going to be transparency within the management structures? Is there going to be a culture of constructive dialogue between the board and the executive to make sure that they can have genuine assurance as to compliance with the new Building Safety Act when it eventually does get passed, and that the mistakes of the past regarding Grenfell are not going to be repeated? So those are my challenges to you as we conclude, and I appreciate that perhaps that presents as many questions as it does answers. But I think that is one of the key takeaways at this point in the very formative stages of legislation. It is going to be a seismic change in the way that we approach this whole topic, and we have to be ready to rise to that challenge and meet the challenges of the future. As I say, thank you very much for listening to this presentation. If you do have any questions off the back of it, then do feel free to drop us a line via email, and we'll see how we can assist. And obviously, as we get more further details from this emerging legislation when we'll be looking to run further topics of training and presentations as more information comes to light. Thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.